My wife did not just ask the judge for money. She asked him to put a price on my father's grave. I was sitting in a courtroom in Bozeman, Montana, with my hands folded on the table and a brown leather folder resting in front of me like it weighed nothing. Across the aisle, Morgan Whitaker sat beside her attorney in a white suit, calm, polished, and certain. She looked less like a woman ending a marriage and more like a business partner waiting for her payout. Her lawyer, Brandon Keller, stood before Judge Margaret Ellis and said, "Your Honor, my client is seeking $8.5 million, along with equitable interest in Whitaker Family Ranch, including appreciation tied to the cattle operation, event revenue, grazing leases, and future development potential." He said it smoothly, like he was reading from a dinner menu instead of carving up 3 generations of my family. I looked at Morgan when he said ranch. She did not blink. That told me everything. She was not ashamed of the number. She was not ashamed of the land. She believed she had waited long enough beside me to own the dirt beneath my childhood. Judge Ellis glanced over her notes, then looked at my attorney, Eleanor Hayes. Eleanor did not stand yet. She only placed one steady hand near the folder and gave me the smallest nod, the kind that said not yet. I trusted her. I had trusted too many people in my life, but Eleanor had earned it with evidence, not promises. Brandon kept going. He talked about lifestyle, marital appreciation, public-facing ranch events, and Morgan's supposed role in modernizing the Whitaker name. He described her hosting donor dinners, standing beside me at livestock auctions, helping with charity weekends, smiling in photographs with sponsors from Bozeman and Billings. Every sentence turned presence into ownership. By that logic, anyone who wore boots near a fence could claim the pasture. Morgan lowered her eyes at the right moments, as if the courtroom were a stage and grief were lighting. I almost admired how well she performed sincerity after practicing contempt for years. The ranch had not always interested her. When we first married, she called it dusty, remote, and too far from real life. She hated the drive, hated the wind, hated how spring mud swallowed nice shoes. She used to ask why my father fought so hard to keep land that smelled like hay, diesel, horses, and weather. Back then, she said she married me, not the ranch. I remember that sentence because my father did too. Thomas Whitaker had heard it from across his kitchen table, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug, his old knuckles swollen from decades of work. He had looked at Morgan with tired kindness and said, "Then you will understand why the land stays protected." She smiled then. She even nodded. Now, 7 years later, her attorney was asking a judge to give her leverage over the same land she once promised she would never touch. The cruelty was not that she wanted money. Divorce has numbers. I understood that. The cruelty was that she wanted the ranch because developers had started circling Montana like birds over fresh grain. Land near Bozeman had become a prize for people who wanted luxury cabins, wedding retreats, and private roads with names invented by marketing teams. Morgan had seen appraisals rise and suddenly discovered affection for the view. She did not fall in love with the ranch. She fell in love with what it could be sold for. Brandon clicked to another exhibit on the courtroom screen. A photo appeared of Morgan and me at a charity dinner in the main barn, string lights above us, donors smiling around rented tables. Mrs. Whitaker was central to the ranch's public identity, he said. I stared at the picture and remembered carrying folding chairs until midnight after she went home early because her feet hurt. Morgan looked at the image like proof. I looked at it like a receipt for patience. Judge Ellis finally turned toward Eleanor. "Counsel, I will need to see any trust instrument or separate property acknowledgement relevant to this ranch." Morgan's mouth curved slightly. She thought the request helped her. I placed my palm on the brown folder. She thought I had been silent because I was afraid. I had been silent because my father taught me land does not defend itself. Men do, with fences, work, and paper. The judge's request did not surprise me, because my father had prepared for that moment long before Morgan ever learned to love the word appraisal. Thomas Whitaker was not a sentimental man in the soft way people expect from old ranchers. He did not frame poems or talk about legacy over dinner unless the weather had already ruined the day and left him no work to do. But he believed land carried memory, and he believed memory was useless if a family failed to protect it with records, signatures, and boundaries. When I was 19, he made me mend fence posts through a March wind that cut across the valley like broken glass. I complained that paperwork would have been easier. He handed me a hammer and said, "Paper only matters after someone forgets what work means." Years later, when Morgan and I got engaged, he asked us to sit with his attorney in the old ranch office, the one that smelled like coffee, dust, and saddle soap. Morgan wore a blue dress and acted patient, though I could see she wanted the meeting finished before lunch in town. The attorney explained the Whitaker Heritage Trust, the protected ranch land, the grazing leases, the mineral rights, and the appreciation tied directly to the trust. It was separate property, preserved before our marriage and documented, so the land would not become a prize in future disputes. Morgan listened with a polite smile and said, "I do not care about dirt. I am marrying Caleb, not a ranch." My father studied her face for a long second, then slid the acknowledgement across the desk. She signed beside the notary's stamp without asking a single hard question. That memory sat beside me in court while Brandon Keller kept building Morgan's sainthood from photographs and folded napkins. He showed invitations where her name appeared as hostess, charity posts from social media, receipts for flower arrangements, and a glossy article from Montana Lifestyle magazine that called us the young face of historic ranching. He did not show the mornings she slept through calving season, the winters she refused to drive the gravel road, or the night she told me the ranch made her feel buried alive. He did not show the developer's brochure I found in her purse 2 months before she filed, with red circles around creekside acreage and handwritten notes about cabin clusters. Eleanor let him finish. She never interrupted a bad argument before it revealed what it truly wanted. Judge Ellis asked Brandon whether Morgan had any evidence of financial contribution to the original acquisition of the ranch land. Brandon shifted his weight and said contribution can be more than checks. He said Morgan contributed image, hospitality, community relationships, and modernization. I looked at Morgan then, and she looked back as if the word modernization could cover every acre she had once mocked. My attorney stood. Eleanor was not tall, and she did not raise her voice, but the courtroom changed when she buttoned her jacket. "Your Honor," she said, "before counsel continues valuing legacy as if it were inventory, we would like to enter the Whitaker Heritage Trust Acknowledgement and associated exhibits." Morgan turned toward Brandon quickly. Brandon did not turn fast enough to comfort her. That was the first crack. Eleanor opened the brown folder and removed the document my father had stored in a bank box until the day he died. The pages looked plain, almost boring, which is how serious protection often appears before it changes a room. She placed them before the clerk, along with the notary record, the attorney witness statement, the trust schedule, and an email Morgan had sent my father the following morning. I did not read the email yet. I knew every word because grief had made me memorize what paper could still say after father was gone. Judge Ellis accepted the exhibit, adjusted her glasses, and began reading. Morgan sat very still. Outside the courthouse windows, Montana wind pressed against the glass, and for the first time, my wife stopped looking like a woman collecting what she was owed and started looking like a woman remembering what she had promised. Judge Ellis read slowly, and every page seemed to pull the courtroom backward through my life. I was no longer sitting beside Eleanor under fluorescent lights. I was 14 again, standing knee-deep in spring mud while my father showed me how to reset a leaning fence post. Thomas never let me call ranch work punishment. He called it payment for belonging somewhere. When a calf broke through wire, we repaired it before breakfast. When snow bent the north gate, we straightened it before church. That land was never passive wealth. It demanded hands, time, and memory from whoever claimed it. Morgan had never understood that because she met the ranch after the hard parts had already become routine. She arrived to painted barns, organized tack rooms, repaired wells, and a house my mother had kept warm before cancer made winters feel longer. Morgan saw sunsets over hay fields and assumed beauty was the product. She did not see the bank notes my grandfather carried, the drought years my father survived, or the mornings I drove cattle through freezing rain while she slept in flannel sheets and complained the coffee was too strong. I loved her anyway, maybe too generously then. At first, her distance from the ranch felt harmless. She was a city woman from Denver who liked clean sidewalks, reservations, and closets without dust on the boots. I could accept that. Marriage did not require her to love every acre the way I did. But indifference changed when developers started calling. Suddenly, she asked why we kept so much land unused, why old grazing leases mattered, why a view that tourists would pay for should remain behind barbed wire and family pride. She began saying opportunity where my father used to say obligation. The words did not live together. The first real argument came after a developer dinner in Billings she swore was only networking. I found a glossy brochure in her tote the next morning, folded around a map of our creek pasture. Red circles marked possible cabin sites. A note in Morgan's handwriting read, Luxury Retreat Phase 1. I held that paper at the kitchen counter while coffee burned behind me. When I asked her about it, she said I was trapped inside a dead man's dream. That was the first time she turned my father into an obstacle instead of a memory we both owed respect. In court, Brandon Keller tried to make that ambition sound reasonable. He called it development potential, diversification, and modern revenue. He spoke of wedding weekends, eco cabins, and premium land parcels like he was improving a spreadsheet instead of cutting a family name into pieces. Morgan listened with her chin lifted. I remember the night she told me selling 200 acres would not erase my father because memories were portable. I said graves were not portable. She called that dramatic. Some marriages die when two people stop speaking the same language about sacred things and money things. Then silence. Judge Ellis reached the email exhibit, and the courtroom seemed to narrow around Morgan. Eleanor stood beside me without touching my arm, but I felt steadier because she knew the difference between winning and preserving. The email was dated the morning after the trust meeting, addressed to Thomas Whitaker. Morgan had written, "Thank you for explaining the ranch protection. I respect that the land belongs to the Whitaker family. I would never ask Caleb to choose between me and his father's land." The words looked innocent until betrayal made them evidence. Brandon shifted at table, papers suddenly restless under his hand. Morgan did not look at me. She watched the judge because judges are harder to manipulate with old smiles. Judge Ellis asked whether the signature was hers. Brandon rose halfway, but Morgan answered first, barely audible. Yes. Then the judge asked whether the email came from her account. Another yes. I did not feel victory. I felt my father standing somewhere beyond that window, saying paper only matters after someone forgets what work means. Morgan had forgotten. The document remembered. And in that silence, the ranch finally had a voice stronger than every number she had brought to court. Brandon Keller recovered first, because attorneys are paid to keep moving after truth trips them. He stood with one hand on the table and said, "Your Honor, we do not dispute that the email appears to exist, but we do dispute the legal understanding surrounding the acknowledgement at the time of execution." Judge Ellis looked over her glasses. "Counsel, your client just confirmed the signature and the email." "Yes, Your Honor, but context matters." Mrs. Whitaker was not represented by independent counsel in the same capacity, and the document may not reflect a fully informed waiver of marital appreciation. Eleanor rose calmly. "Your Honor, the meeting notes identify separate counsel offered and declined, a notary present, and a follow-up email confirming comprehension. The trust predates the marriage. The ranch land predates the marriage, and the appreciation at issue is tied directly to protected trust assets." Brandon began to answer, but the judge lifted one hand. The courtroom obeyed instantly. That was the thing about real authority. It did not need volume. Morgan kept staring at the table. I wondered if she was remembering the old ranch office, my father's coffee cup, the dust on the window ledge, the way she tapped her nail against the pen before signing because she wanted lunch at the steakhouse in town. She had treated the document like an inconvenience between her and a reservation. Now it sat between her and $8.5 million. Judge Ellis turned to Morgan. "Mrs. Whitaker, did anyone force you to sign this acknowledgement?" Morgan swallowed. "No, Will you give an opportunity to ask questions? Yes. Did you send this email voluntarily the following day? Morgan's voice dropped. Yes. The word landed softer than a whisper and harder than a hammer. Brandon shifted again, searching for a safer road. Your Honor, my client contributed significantly to the ranch's public image during the marriage. Eleanor opened another exhibit. Public image is not title. Hosting donor dinners does not convert protected trust land into marital property. She paused just long enough for the sentence to settle. And if counsel wishes to discuss public image, we should also address the correspondence between Mrs. Whitaker and Silver Ridge Development. Morgan's head snapped up. Brandon turned toward her too quickly. That was the second crack, larger than the first. I had not wanted that email used unless necessary. It was ugly in a different way, not because it protected the ranch, but because it showed motive. Eleanor handed the exhibit to the clerk. This email, dated 6 weeks before the divorce filing, includes the phrase, "Once the divorce starts, the ranch value becomes leverage." It was sent from Mrs. Whitaker's personal account to a land development consultant in Billings. The courtroom went so quiet I could hear someone shift in the back row. Morgan closed her eyes. I did not. I looked at the judge, because looking at Morgan would have turned grief into accusation. Judge Ellis read the line, then read it again. Mrs. Whitaker, she said, "Is this your email?" Brandon stood. Your Honor, I would advise my client not to answer without clarification of scope. Judge Ellis did not blink. This is a civil proceeding regarding claimed property interests. The court is evaluating relevance and credibility. Morgan opened her eyes. Yes, she said. There it was. Not a misunderstanding. Not a wife swept up in divorce confusion. Leverage. She had written the word herself. The ranch was not a home to her, not a heritage, not even a lifestyle she had helped polish. It was pressure. It was a number she could push against my ribs until I surrendered something else. Eleanor returned to her seat and placed both hands on the table. She did not smile. Good attorneys know that dignity is more persuasive than celebration. Judge Ellis called for a short recess to review the documents. The gavel sounded once, and everyone stood. Morgan remained seated a second too long before Brandon touched her elbow. I gathered the folder and stepped into the hallway with Eleanor. The courthouse corridor smelled like old wood and printer ink. Through the tall window, I could see the mountains beyond Bozeman, pale under the afternoon light. Eleanor said, "That went as well as it could." I nodded. It still feels like losing. She understood. Keeping what someone tried to take is not the same as getting back what they destroyed. Across the hallway, Morgan stood with Brandon, no longer polished, no longer certain. She looked at me then, and for the first time all morning, she seemed less angry than exposed. During the recess, Morgan tried to walk toward me, but Brandon caught her sleeve before she crossed the hallway. That small gesture said more than his arguments had. Her own attorney no longer trusted her to speak without damaging herself. I stood beside the window with Eleanor while people moved around us carrying folders, coffee cups, and lives that were not being measured against a ranch. Morgan's white suit looked too bright under the courthouse lights now, almost costume-like, and I wondered how long she had imagined this day, ending with me cornered in a buying piece. $8.5 million was never just a number. It was a leash. It was the amount she thought would make me choose between my future and my father's land. Eleanor opened her notes. The judge may not make a final property ruling today, she said. But the trust issue is much stronger now. Strong enough? I asked. Strong enough to change the room. I looked through the glass at the mountains beyond Bozeman. They had seen Whitakers come and go, seen fences rot and get rebuilt, seen storms flatten hay and spring bring it back. Courts felt powerful because people sat higher and spoke carefully, but the land had a different kind of authority. It waited. It outlived fear. When a bailiff called us back, Morgan entered first. She did not look at the gallery, and she did not look at me. Brandon whispered something, and she nodded like a student who had failed the first exam and was trying not to fail the next. Judge Ellis returned with the documents stacked beside her. I have reviewed the trust acknowledgement, the notary materials, the attorney witness statement, the post-meeting email, and the development correspondence, she said. No one moved. For purposes of today's temporary and preliminary property considerations, this court is not persuaded that Whitaker Family Ranch should be treated as an ordinary marital asset subject to immediate division or leverage. Morgan's hands tightened around pen. Brandon rose. Your Honor, we would ask the court to preserve our ability to argue appreciation at a later evidentiary hearing. You may preserve your argument, Judge Ellis said, but you may not use unsupported claims to pressure sale, partition, or development of protected trust land while these documents remain unrebutted. The word unrebutted landed cleanly. It did not cheer. It did not punish. It simply removed the blade Morgan had pressed against the ranch. Eleanor stood. Thank you, Your Honor. Brandon sat slowly. Morgan turned toward him, confused by the quietness of losing. She had expected a thunderclap, maybe a dramatic ruling she could call unfair. Instead, the court had taken away her favorite weapon in ordinary language. Judge Ellis continued, the parties may continue addressing verified marital assets, income, and any documented contributions outside the trust structure. However, the court will not entertain speculative development values as a basis for coercive negotiation at this stage. Speculative, coercive, negotiation. 3 words that made Morgan's glossy appraisal look less like evidence and more like ambition wearing a calculator. I kept my face still because my father had taught me another rule. Never dance on ground you're trying to keep sacred. When the judge called for schedules and next filings, the room became procedural again. Dates, deadlines, disclosures, mediation. The machinery of divorce resumed after the ranch had been pulled out from under Morgan's reach. That was when grief found room to breathe. I should have felt relief, and part of me did, but another part kept staring at the email line in my mind. Once the divorce starts, the ranch value becomes leverage, not regret, not confusion, strategy. She had planned to turn my father's promise into a bargaining chip before I even knew she was leaving emotionally. After court adjourned, Eleanor and I gathered our documents. Morgan waited near the door, eyes damp, her voice lower than I had ever heard it in public. Caleb, she said, I did not think it would go like this. I looked at the folder in my hand. That is because you thought the land was only worth money. She flinched. I was scared. No, I said. You were ambitious. Brandon murmured her name, warning her away. For once, she listened. Outside the courthouse, the Montana wind hit harder than it had through the windows, carrying dust from the street and the distant smell of cut hay from somewhere beyond town. Eleanor walked beside me to the parking lot, her heels steady on the concrete, the brown folder tucked under her arm like an ordinary office item instead of the thing that had stopped Morgan from putting a price tag on my family's past. Do not answer her calls tonight, she said. Let Brandon communicate through proper channels. I looked back at the courthouse doors. Morgan had not come out yet. She will call anyway. Then let her learn that not every door opens because she wants to explain. I nodded, but the sentence followed me into my truck. Explanation had always been Morgan's favorite second act. First came the choice. Then came the version of the choice that made her sound wounded, misunderstood, or forced by someone else's failure. She had done it when she met the developer in Billings. She had done it when I found the brochure. She had done it when I asked why she suddenly cared about turning the east pasture into luxury cabins. She would tell me she was thinking of our future, that I was trapped in grief, that my father would have wanted the ranch to evolve. But my father had left notes in his own handwriting, and none of them said sell the creek bottom to people who wanted imported stone fireplaces and sunset packages. I drove west out of Bozeman instead of going home right away. The road opened toward the valley, past fields still pale from the season, past fence lines that leaned and held, past mailboxes with names people in town hadn't known for 50 years. My phone buzzed before I reached the county road. Morgan. I let it ring. She called again 2 minutes later. Then came a text. Caleb, please. I need you to understand why I did this. I read it at a stop sign and placed the phone face down in the console. Need is a dangerous word when it arrives after consequence. She had needed me to understand dust, distance, loneliness, ambition, fear of being stuck. But she had never needed to understand what the ranch cost before it gained value. She had never needed to understand how my grandfather mortgaged equipment to keep the north section, how my mother worked books at the kitchen table during calving season, how my father made me memorize parcel boundaries before I could legally drink. When something benefits people quietly, they start believing it was always easy. At the ranch gate, I stopped the truck and sat with the engine running. The Whitaker sign hung between two cedar posts, the letters weathered but still clear. My father had repainted it the summer before he died, refusing help because he said a man ought to touch his own name sometimes. I got out and ran my hand along the top rail. The wood was rough, sun-cracked, honest. No courtroom language could improve it. No appraisal could explain why the ground beneath my boots felt like a conversation with everyone I had lost. My phone buzzed again. Eleanor this time. Brandon requested informal settlement discussion. I declined until full disclosures. I typed, "Thank you." Then Morgan sent another message. "I never meant to hurt your father's memory." I looked across the pasture where the old family cemetery sat behind a low iron fence, 3 cottonwoods moving in the wind. That was the part she still did not understand. Memory had not been hurt by one filing. It had been studied, valued, and weaponized. She had not stumbled into greed. She had organized it. I drove up to the ranch house and parked near the barn. The porch steps creaked under my boots, the same way they had when I was a boy carrying feed buckets too heavy for my arms. Inside, the house was cold and quiet, but it did not feel empty. It felt guarded. I set the brown folder on my father's old desk, beside the brass lamp and the coffee stain he never let anyone sand out. Then I opened it and read Morgan's email again. I would never ask Caleb to choose between me and his father's land. The cruelest lies are not the ones people tell you. They are the promises they once meant, then later decide are inconvenient. That night at the ranch, I slept in my father's old room because the main bedroom still felt like Morgan's arguments had followed me inside. The walls were plain pine, the quilt heavy, the window facing the north pasture where moonlight turned the fence line silver. I lay awake listening to the house settle, hearing every creak as if Thomas were walking through it with coffee in one hand and a warning in the other. My phone stayed face down on the nightstand. Morgan called twice after midnight, then stopped. In the morning, Eleanor sent a brief message. Preliminary ruling entered. Ranch protected pending final hearing. Morgan's side is requesting mediation. I read it while standing at the kitchen sink, looking out toward the barn where my father had once taught me to sharpen a hoof knife with patience instead of pressure. Protected pending final hearing. Legal language never feels warm, but that phrase came close. It meant the ranch could breathe while the rest of the divorce sorted itself into numbers. It meant Morgan could still argue about money, accounts, vehicles, and ordinary marital assets, but she could not keep holding the ranch over the table like a match near dry grass. I made coffee in my father's dented percolator and sat at his desk with the brown folder open. Beneath Morgan's email was another document Eleanor had not needed to use in court yet. A handwritten note from Thomas, dated 3 weeks before a wedding. He had written, "Caleb, love your wife with open hands, but keep the ranch in closed papers. A good woman will never resent protection. A wrong one will reveal herself against it." I had hated that note when I first found it after he died. It felt harsh, suspicious, unfair to Morgan before she had done anything. Now it felt less like doubt and more like a lantern left on a porch. Around 10, a truck rolled up the gravel drive. It was Sam Doyle, our ranch manager, a man who had worked for my father long enough to know when not to ask questions too quickly. He stepped into the kitchen, removed his hat, and saw the folder on the desk. "Court go bad?" he asked. "Not for the land." He nodded once. The way ranchmen nod when relief is too private to display. "Good. Your dad would have raised Cain if he heard half the rumors in town." I looked up. "What rumors?" Sam grimaced. That Morgan's people were telling developers she might control sale rights soon. Silver Ridge had someone drive the South Road last week, taking photos from the fence. The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. I had known about the emails. Hearing strangers had already come looking at our pasture made it feel less like strategy and more like trespass, even if they stayed on the road. Did they enter? No. I made sure they understood the gate was not decorative. I appreciated the restraint in his wording. Sam would never make trouble if a warning could do the job. Thank you, I said. He looked toward the window. Your father always said the worst threats to a ranch were clean boots. After he left, I called Eleanor. She listened, then asked for dates, road location, description, and names if Sam had any. We will include it in the development correspondence record, she said. It supports intent. Intent. Another cold word that carried heat underneath. Morgan had not merely asked for money after a marriage failed. She had built a runway for someone else's plan to land on my family's ground. That afternoon, Brandon finally sent his settlement proposal. Eleanor forwarded it with no comment, which told me it was insulting before I opened it. Morgan would withdraw immediate ranch sale demands if I paid a substantial cash settlement and agreed to grant her a percentage of future ranch event income for 15 years. I laughed once, alone in the office, not because it was funny, but because greed can learn new clothes faster than shame learns humility. She could not take the land, so now she wanted rent from its name. I closed the proposal and walked outside to the fence line. Wind moved through the grass, bending it but not uprooting it. That was when I understood the next fight would not be about whether Morgan could claim the ranch. It would be about whether I would pay her to stop trying. The mediation took place the following Thursday in a conference room above a bank in downtown Bozeman, the kind of room with thick carpet, bottled water, and windows that made mountains look like framed art instead of living ground. Morgan sat across from me in a gray suit this time, less bright than the white one, less certain too. Brandon Keller was beside her with a stack of papers and the cautious expression of a man trying not to look as though his best argument had already died in court. Eleanor sat on my right, the brown folder closed, but visible because some documents speak even when nobody opens them. The mediator began with the usual words about cooperation, efficiency, and avoiding unnecessary litigation. I listened politely. Morgan looked at her hands. When Brandon presented the revised proposal, he used phrases like practical resolution and future income participation, but the meaning had not changed. Morgan would abandon any claim to force a sale if I gave her cash and a long percentage of ranch event revenue. I waited until he finished. Then I said, "You are still trying to rent my father's name back to me." Morgan looked up sharply. "That is not fair." "It is accurate." Brandon cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitaker, this is a compromise." Eleanor answered before I could. A compromise requires a legitimate claim. The preliminary order rejected pressure on the trust land, and future event revenue tied to protected family assets remains disputed at best. Morgan leaned forward. "I hosted those events. You attended them," I said. "You chose flowers. You smiled for donors. You left before cleanup." Her face flushed, because small truths can embarrass more than large accusations. "I was your wife." "Yes," I said. "That was the part one valued. You were the one who turned it into an invoice." The mediator asked whether we might separate ranch income from personal marital assets. Eleanor laid out the financial line with patience. Bank accounts earned during the marriage could be reviewed. Household assets could be divided. Vehicles, savings, and ordinary income could be negotiated. But the ranch land, trust appreciation, grazing leases tied to the trust, and protected family equity were not bargaining chips. Morgan listened, and I watched her realize that the world she had imagined was shrinking back to legal size. After an hour, the mediator separated us into different rooms. I sat with Eleanor while cattle trucks rolled past on the street below. "They're testing whether you will pay for silence," she said. "I know. Do you want it?" I looked at the closed folder. "No, I want to pay what is fair and not $1 for fear." Eleanor nodded. "Then we hold that line." In the other room, Morgan must have finally heard the same thing from Brandon, because when we returned to the table, her shoulders had lowered. She did not look triumphant, only tired. "I was angry," she said. "I thought if I could make the ranch part of this, you would have to take me seriously." The honesty was ugly, but at least it was no longer decorated. "I took you seriously when you were my wife," I said. "You just wanted me cornered." She wiped one tear quickly, as if ashamed of needing it. I hated feeling second to that place. You were not second to the ranch. You were second to the promise you kept asking me to break. That sentence ended the room for a moment. Even Brandon stopped moving papers. Morgan looked at the table and whispered, "Your father knew, did he not?" I thought of Thomas's note, his closed papers, his warning I once resented. He knew land attracts hunger when it becomes valuable. The settlement shifted after that. Morgan withdrew claims against the ranch itself and future trust income. In exchange, we agreed to a structured division of verified marital assets, a reasonable support period, and mutual confidentiality around development correspondence, except where legally required. It was not forgiveness. It was containment. When we signed the preliminary term sheet, Morgan stared at her own signature as if it had betrayed her before and might again. Outside, she stopped beside the elevator. "Caleb," she said, "I did not just want the money. I wanted proof I mattered." I looked at her, sadder than angry. "You mattered before you tried to sell what mattered to me." 2 weeks after mediation, the final order arrived by email while I was replacing a hinge on the north barn door. Eleanor called before I opened the attachment. "The ranch remains protected," she said. "The court accepts the trust structure and excludes the land from marital division. Ordinary assets will follow the settlement terms." I thanked her, ended the call, and stood with the wrench in my hand, listening to cattle bawl beyond the fence. Relief did not rush in like music. It arrived carefully, like a horse approaching a gate it still did not trust after storm. I walked to the family cemetery at the edge of the cottonwoods, where Thomas Whitaker's stone faced the pasture he had refused to sell through drought, debt, and every tempting offer that came dressed as progress. The grass was high around the iron fence, so I pulled weeds by hand until my knuckles filled with dust. "We kept it," I said aloud, feeling foolish and grateful at once. The wind took the words across the field. My father had been gone for 5 years, but that morning his silence felt less like absence and more like approval from hard ground. Morgan signed the final settlement without another attempt at the ranch. Brandon sent a short note through Eleanor saying she accepted the terms and requested that all remaining communication stay practical. Practical was a mercy we had not deserved earlier. She received a fair division of marital savings, her vehicle, temporary support, and the household items she wanted from the Bozeman place we had rented during court weeks. She received no percentage of future ranch income, no development rights, and no permission to attach her disappointment to land my family had carried longer than she had known my middle name. The day she came for her boxes, I stayed in the saddle room while Sam Doyle supervised movers at the ranch house. Morgan asked to speak for 1 minute on the porch. Eleanor would have advised against it, but I went because some endings deserve a clean door. She wore jeans, a tan coat, and no jewelry except the small silver bracelet my mother had given her our first Christmas. "I'm not asking for anything," she said. "I know I try to turn your promise into my payday." The sentence sounded true because it embarrassed her to say. I looked past her at the porch boards my father and I had replaced when I was 22, each plank fitted during a week of late summer rain. "You wanted proof you mattered," I said. "You had it when I brought you here, trusted you with my name, and believed your promise." Morgan nodded. "I know that now. Knowing late does not make it false." Her eyes filled, but she did not ask me to soften the consequence. That restraint was the closest thing to respect she had offered since the divorce began in court papers. After the movers left, I walked through the ranch house alone. The rooms looked larger without Morgan's framed photographs and city furniture, but not happier. Empty space is not peace by itself. I paused at my father's desk, opened the brown folder one last time, and placed the trust acknowledgement beside his handwritten note. "Love your wife with open hands, but keep the ranch in closed papers." I had once thought that line was cynical. Now I understood it as mercy. Protection had not destroyed my marriage. It had revealed what my marriage had become before paper spoke in court. At sunset, I drove the fence line in the old truck, the folder on the passenger seat and dust lifting behind the tires. The west pasture glowed gold, and the creek moved quietly through grass Morgan once marked for cabins. I stopped by the north gate, stepped out, and rested both hands on the rail. The ranch was still there because my father believed, love should never require blindness. I had lost a wife, but not the land, the name, or the promise. When the sun dropped behind the Montana ridge, I closed the folder and finally drove home free.